Every day when we come to work at the Morin Center, we feel that we are carrying on the work of Ed Lane-Reticker. He inspires us continuously, as I know he does you, with the memories of his congeniality and his bright blue eyes. We were talking about that earlier, and many of us would not be here were it not for his guidance. But today is a special day for us because this is the day where we attempt to pass upon all of his goodness to the communities that we serve, including our marvelous students, including the greater Boston University community, and including the Boston community. So I'd just like to ask Lori Lane-Reticker and Stoddard Reticker and Allison Lane-Reticker and Ed's son-in-law, Gene Gaddis, to stand up and let us recognize their presence here today. As part of the mission that we are carrying out, we are consistently reaching out to broader and broader constituencies. And I'm happy to say that the Morin Center and our faculty and our extended network of friends, what we call Friends of the Morin Center. And oh, by the way, let me just add, if any of you who are not students did not sign in and would like to become members of what we call the FOMC, that's not the Federal Open Market Committee, it's a Friend of the Morin Center, and you did not sign in, kindly leave your business card on the desk on the way out, and you'll be captured in our database forever and be invited to events like this. But I'm proud that the Morin Center has been in the middle of the debate about financial services reform. It's unfortunate that it took a near or an excess of a depression to get us there, but we would not be able to be in the midst of that debate were it not for the continuing support of Maureen O'Rourke, our dean. Let me give you an example. A week from tomorrow, we will be hosting a major symposium in Washington, D.C. You may have heard of some of our speakers: Paul Volcker, Sheila Bair, John Dugan, the comptroller of the currency. And we're able to do that because of the support and the encouragement that Maureen O'Rourke has given to the center over these last few years. Maureen O'Rourke is going to introduce Marsh Carter, and I hand it over to you, Maureen.
Great, thanks, Con. Well, I'll be very brief, and I should start by recognizing Con for all of his efforts as director of the Morin Center for Banking and Financial Law at the law school. Within the law school, the Morin Center has in some ways been a hidden jewel. And Con has made great strides in turning it into not so hidden a jewel, and we hope to continue that trend going forward. For any of our current students who are here, it is a resource that you should avail yourselves of. Up on the 15th floor, we offer a 7-semester LLM program and also, of course, a year-long LLM program. So if banking and financial law is something that you're interested in, please do take a ride up in the elevators to the 15th floor and introduce yourselves to the staff there. And I would like to acknowledge the staff at the Morin Center, also Lorraine and Martin and Shannon, in addition to Con, who've just done a terrific job, as well as our event planner, Andrea Larson, in putting today's event together. So let's give them a round of applause. The Morin Center has always been very active in terms of curriculum on the LLM side. What Con has really done is to turn it into a thought leader in banking and financial law. And so you can see Con quoted in the papers, on TV. You really can't read about the banking crisis in this country without coming across the Morin Center, and that redounds all to the good of Boston University and the School of Law. And so we're very proud of him and the center. As Con mentioned, he had some illustrious predecessors, and that, of course, included Ed Lane-Reticker. And I realize that most of you here didn't know Ed. Many of our faculty remember him, and his legacy certainly lives on at the Morin Center. The thing I think that was most impressive about Ed, or the way to sum him up, is with one word, and that's gentleman, and everything that that word implies, literally gentleman. and we miss him tremendously here. I think from my perspective, the thing that was always the most impressive about Ed was that when he married Lori, they both changed their names so that they both had their last names. That's how we got to Lane-Reticker. And that was over 50 years ago. You couldn't get most men to do that today. And he did it over 50 years ago. So I think that kind of encapsulates Ed a little bit. And so I'm delighted to welcome the Lane-Reticker family and also all of the friends of the Morin Center. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a terrific talk. And so I will stop talking and turn it over to Marsh Carter. Marsh is the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange Group and deputy chairman of the parent company, New York Stock Exchange Euronext. Mr. Carter has served as a director of the New York Stock Exchange since November 2003, and he's had an illustrious career. Prior to joining the NYSE, he was chairman and CEO of State Street Bank and Trust Company, and also worked earlier for Chase Manhattan Bank. He served in the Ford administration and at the State Department, and before that was a Marine Corps infantry officer serving 2 combat tours in Vietnam. And as an infantry company commander, he was awarded the Navy Cross and the Purple Heart. And I think in an economic time like this, it's nice to feel that we're in such good hands. He's been a director and board member of Allied Signal Honeywell and is currently the chair of the Board of Trustees at the Boston Medical Center. He holds a BSD degree from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, an MS in Operations Research and Systems Analysis from the Naval Postgraduate School, and an MA from George Washington University. And so we're delighted today to welcome Marsh Carter.
Thanks very much for that introduction. My dad would have been proud and my mom would have believed it. In the fall of 2003, when Dick Grasso and the board, the entire 26-person board of the New York Stock Exchange was dismissed, I was one of 7 executives asked to come out of retirement and form the new board. At that time, the New York Stock Exchange had one product, stocks. It was owned by the 1,366 seat holders. The seat holders had gone back to 1792 when the exchange was started, but 902 of them were retired, living in Florida and Arizona. It had an 85% market share in stock trading, but it took between 9 and 14 seconds for a share to be traded on the floor. And the clerks you see on the floor that you see on TV every night had reached the limit of human-machine intervention. Some of them were keystroking 40,000 keystrokes a day. It is now, almost 6 years later, a public company with exchanges in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Paris, Brussels, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and London, with about 5,000 companies listed. That gives us a very interesting view of the world economy. So let me talk for 20 or 25 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion, because that's the more interesting part. A year or so ago, none of us would have imagined the events that have unfolded in our financial system. The impact is felt throughout America and globally. It still has the potential to bring down the financial system and the economy. It's been harmful to many people and businesses. It's inspired a great loss of value and confidence in the financial services industry. Our equity investment culture, a bedrock of asset allocation since the 1960s, is probably gone forever. As a result, we are and will undergo the largest financial re-engineering endeavor in U.S. history, structure as well as regulation. Already, there are no major investment banks left, with Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley being commercialized. 60% of U.S. families are exposed to stock and other markets, or their pensions or 401ks, now affectionately known as their 201ks. Recent market swings in the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ may mean that we are in a trader's market, not an investor's market. Long-term investors may be slow coming back to the market. In fact, I've had many people here, I live across the river in Cambridge, tell me that they cannot handle these 400 up, 300 down, 200 up swings, and they are out of the stock market and are going into the 3% CDs. This crisis is going to force a transformation in the way our financial markets and institutions do business, and likely alter the familiar roles of the Fed and the SEC. Now, if you summarize the dozen or so interdependent events and stack them vertically, what do you have? Drawing on the Bible, although as a Catholic here in Boston, I'm religiously challenged, but if you draw on what we all know from our Bible and Sunday school classes as a child, God confounded a presumptuous attempt to build a tower into heaven by confusing the language of the builders into many mutually incomprehensible languages. It seems here that we have both the Tower of Prophets and the incomprehensible languages. You start off with unscrupulous and unregulated mortgage origination and mortgage sales techniques. You have a robust and overvalued housing market, and then the borrowers have had difficulty making payments due to gas prices, overextended credit, the housing slump, and medical expenses. A long time ago, no bank would lend you money more than 30% of your gross income for what was called PITI, which was principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Some of the people that have gone into foreclosure have had debt service of 50% of their gross income pre-tax. You had congressional and political pressure for more dangerous lending. The Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA's loans went from 6% in 2002 to 30% in 2006. Now, CRA has done some wonderful things in urban areas in America, but 30% of our total mortgage market may be too high. Banks also discovered that they could downstream or upstream or securitize loans and receive a lot of money in fees rather than keep the loans on their books. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac launched lobbying efforts to have low capital requirements, and in fact they were putting the securitized assets that they were securitizing into their own books, which gave them double jeopardy as well as an interesting metric for their bonuses. Fannie and Freddie were 50% of the American mortgage market, which is probably too high. You had a business model shift to public companies by the investment banks, which meant that they had to create high leverage and go to borrowed capital. Some of them were leveraged 30 to 40 times. In the old days, the capital of companies like Goldman Sachs and Lehman, Bear Stearns came from the partners. You also had a business model shift in the early 90s where CEOs of companies, especially Fortune 500 companies, were told that they needed to own 4 or 5 times their annual salary and direct ownership of stocks, of the company stock. It's a little hard to reach that with your after-tax salary, so the metric for CEOs became how much stock can you own and how wealthy can you get in a few years. The rating agency role in high ratings, I don't believe the rating agencies have been called to account for what they've done. There's a conflict with who pays their fees and the public service nature of ratings. Talk about the old Wall Street joke about putting lipstick on a pig. You've seen some of the testimony before Congress of how they gave AAA ratings. Oftentimes, the real danger of a AAA rating is that some people see the rating and would not do their own due diligence. You had the use and the growth of credit default swaps. The credit default swaps are a legitimate financial instrument to balance or offload risk, but the law of unintended consequences happened when used as pure financial activity with no underlying commercial activity. The term swaps was used to avoid the term insurance because state regulators would come in if they used it as an insurance terminology. You also had a lot of financial activity based upon mathematical models, which on the far ends of the distribution did not have catastrophic events factored into the math models. So you would have a math model that was being used where the most extreme assumption would be, well, perhaps the mortgage market will flatten out. But nobody had an assumption that said, well, what do we do if the market totally collapses and you have half the people in foreclosure? You had the refusal of the regulatory bodies, the SEC and the CFTC, to address the growth of derivatives. In American history, lack of regulation generally means lack of transparency, which means lack of transparent valuation procedures, and has always in the past meant a problem. Only full transparency of the dark segments of the market will avoid a repeat of this in the future. One of the major companies that was securitizing mortgages made about $800 million by securitizing in 1 year. In the summer of 2006, they determined that they could securitize like crazy, but they couldn't sell them, and they were taking them on their own books. The CEO didn't want to hear that bad news and fired the risk management executive. You had the failure of CEOs and boards to do adequate risk management. Oftentimes, these products fell between credit and market and trading risk, and only a few firms actually did the right thing and stayed away. You had excess holdings of what was believed to be prime, well-rated paper by many institutional investors domestically and overseas. And we saw in the paper last week at the G20 meetings, they all were blaming us, but they could have done their own due diligence. You had the failure of the SEC's Wall Street Voluntary Regulatory Program. The term Wall Street Voluntary Regulatory Program has got to be one of those all-time great oxymorons like, I'm from the dean's office, I'm here to help you. I'll think highly of you in the morning, and the check is in the mail. There's probably a real issue as to whether the SEC is staffed properly. Perhaps too many lawyers, bad news for this crowd. But a lot of people, if they made a dozen trips to see Mr. Madoff, but no one detected the fact that he was his own custodian, the fact that his monthly reporting computer was not hooked to any other computers, the fact that he did not issue tax accounting reports at the end of the year, those were clearly red flags that a lot of institutional investors picked up on and did not invest with him. The result was the credit crisis. And the credit crisis has been described as a little bit like the way McDonald's is organized now. You know, McDonald's has changed their organization. You drive up and you talk into the radio box, and then you go to the first window, and the first window you give your money, and you go to the second window and get your cholesterol and hamburger, French fries. People were afraid to give their money, the banks, at the first window because they were afraid they would not get their hamburger. And the issue in the credit crisis was they were afraid to lend money, afraid that they would not be paid back. So the ultimate analysis is that markets, regardless of how well or poorly regulated, are dependent upon investor and player confidence in each other. Individually, those 12 or 13 things are not bad, but stacked one on top of the other and happening within a period of about 6 months is what brought us to where we are today, perhaps not even at the bottom yet. While many in the media have blamed this on a lack of regulation, in fact, there is ultimately a limit to how much regulation can do. In the final analysis, you can write all the rules you want, but there has to be a philosophy of ethical behavior that comes from human beings operating in a professional and ethical way. Leaders at all levels in business, not just CEOs, have specific responsibilities that encompass the legal and ethical aspects of their jobs. Additionally, though, business leaders have economic responsibilities, and they're expected to make decisions balancing the demands of all three. But recent action, including news that many of the financial institutions that received the government money will pay bonuses this year, in fact, even Fannie and Freddie Mae are paying out about $200 million in bonuses, indicate to me that the balance is not there. And I question the ethics of these actions and many other actions over the last year. Now, even before the problems of the last year, we were beginning to see significant shifts in investment patterns and in the markets. In the ultimate analysis, the stock market, whether it's us or NASDAQ, is a reflection of the confidence people have in the economy and its growth potential. But investor choice a few years ago, driven by speed and the desire for anonymity, forced people to make the choice between a regulated exchange, and they're only NYSE and NASDAQ, or going off market over the counter to other vehicles. So you had this tremendous growth of non-regulated vehicles, hedge funds, private equity, futures, options, derivatives, and electronic crossing networks, which now handle about 50% of shares from the regulated markets. You also had a lot of global competition. The U.S. used to be 55% of the world's investable wealth. It's much less than that now, probably in the high 30s, low 40s. A cause being Sarbanes-Oxley, the uncontrollable litigation environment in this country, and no prospect for tort reform, which other people view as totally crazy. The strength of the currencies overseas, especially the euro, and the fourth reason was no accounting convergence. We still do not have a single accounting standard around the world, although we're moving that way. So one view of the current financial and economic crisis is that of a classic credit boom and bust cycle. The boom having been partially driven by actions whose impact were to increase the demand for debt to unsustainable levels and the growth of financial dealings with very little underlying commercial transactions. Preventing future crises cannot be accomplished simply by keeping the same structure in the regulatory environment. The U.S. in particular, given that its monetary and credit conditions affect a large part of the world, is going to have to take a hard look at our regulatory environment. So what do I think we'll get? I think the first thing we're going to get is some form of systemic oversight regulator. Whether that's a permanent position or temporary for the head of the Fed to take a look at all of the 9 regulatory agencies and see where we're going, I don't think we know that yet. Second, I think we're going to get a regulatory shift to functional regulation from regulating an institution based upon its original charter. So if AIG, an insurance company regulated by a state insurance regulator, is creating hundreds of billions of dollars of securities that are traded over the counter, should be under the oversight of the SEC, and that didn't happen. So we have to go by function, not by the original charter. I think we're going to see some form of oversight in hedge funds. There's about 2,000 hedge funds with about $6 trillion under management, pretty much unregulated. We're already moving to mark-to-market, but I think for a while, until we get out of this, perhaps we should report both mark-to-market and standard accounting. And last week, the SEC reinforced the need for some sort of new uptick rule. They offered 4 or 5 options. The uptick rule prevents a stock from being driven down from, say, 60 to 40 by having circuit breakers in there, or not being able to move the stock without it being on an uprise. I think you're going to see the SEC has already taken some actions on the rating agencies because of the conflict in who pays their fees and what they do. And we're hoping there'll be some clearinghouse where the unregulated securities, CDSs, CDOs, will at least be registered or made transparent. We have 3 or 4 CDS clearing capabilities now around the world, London and Chicago and New York, but the people that are creating these documents, these instruments, are not using them because they haven't been told they have to use them. Now in Europe, you also have some difficulty. I'm a little bit of a Eurosceptic in that I don't know how you can have an economic union without a political union. You have home country protection coming up, especially in France and Ireland. You have the role of the European Central Bank is not as aggressive as ours, and you have 20 of 27 European countries have negative current account balances. But even in this country, I think there are some interesting lessons from the Great Depression. In World War II, when we had 135 million people in the country, the long-term deficit was 35%. We're only at about 12% now. In the Great Depression, one of the things they learned in 1936, when production levels reached the 1929 production levels, was don't cut back on the stimulus too early. Keep it going, because our economy didn't pick up until we started filling airplane and ship and munitions orders from the British and the French, which was about 1939-40. Unemployment then was 25% versus 8.5% now. It may even go to higher than that by the end of the year. The GDP drop in the U.S. is less than 10%, and it was 30%. had no Social Security net in the early part of the Depression. Social Security was started in 1934. Actually, for you students, I wrote a book on that about 10 years ago. It's available on Amazon for a penny. If you buy 6, you get free shipping. And the half-life of a book of Social Security is about 6 months. And I think what people forget is that the stock market crash went in October of 29. Roosevelt was not inaugurated until March of 33. So that depression, the recession, had 3.5 full years to really wind itself up. Finally, I think it may be a little early to assess whether TARP, TALF, PIP, and all the other acronyms are effective. I think I would have liked to seen last September, October, when the initial tranche of money was given to the 9 money center banks and the banks here. I would have liked to seen more hooks on that money. There were no hooks on it. And Management 101 would say if you give somebody $6 billion, at least every 2 weeks they should report back to you what they're doing with it. I think I was very disappointed that some money center bank CEO didn't stand up and say, I have 6,000 commercial lenders that are not doing anything. I'm going to institute a 5-day school and make them mortgage foreclosure analysts and counselors and start attacking this list of foreclosures that we have. I think that somebody should have done that. But other than that, I'm very supportive of what the administration is doing. I think they're moving fast. The question is, how long will it take? And I think that's the big question. So let me open it up to discussions, questions, mostly from the students, if initially.
Before we turn to questions, I did just want to acknowledge 2 people. One is Bob Bench. Bob is a senior fellow at our Morin Center, and Con couldn't be doing all the work he's doing without Bob. So Bob, we're delighted to have you. And also I wanted to recognize Bill Collins. Bill is our outgoing editor-in-chief of the Review of Banking and Financial Law. And I commend the review to all of you because it's a terrific blend of current events as well as more forward-thinking academic-type articles. And it comes out how many times a year, Bill? Twice a year. So I commend that to you as well. And now, Con, did you want to run the Q&A or Marcia?
I can do it. That's fine.
All right.
Sure.
So we'll open it up, and please do use the microphone so we can capture your questions. All right, so I'll ask a question. So, Marcia, I was just curious about, on the New York Stock Exchange and your delisting rules, how many, percentage-wise, is it a non-trivial number of stocks that are at risk of being delisted? What would that really mean to them? And second is, to the extent there's a non-trivial number that run the risk of being delisted, is the exchange thinking about changing the rules to prevent that from happening?
When Fannie and Freddie and Ford Motor Company got in trouble about a year ago, the 3 of them within a few weeks of each other, we went to the Fed and to Treasury and SEC and asked to be able to alleviate our delisting rules. The feeling was to delist Freddie and Fannie and Ford Motor Company a year or so ago would have been disastrous. We do have several dozen companies that are below the standard of a buck or capital requirements or revenue requirements, but right now we are not delisting them, recognizing this is extraordinary times, and some of them have been the victim of people just shorting their stock. So we investigate that and see what's happening. But we're keeping a very close watch on that because we think it would be disastrous for some companies who haven't done anything wrong, but they've been swept down into this downturn in the market. I can probably hear you if you don't want to comment on it.
Sure. With what happened with AIG, I understand that they owned a thrift, so their federal regulator was the OTS, and apparently they had one insurance specialist on staff who was going to leave. Right? I mean, that's probably just kind of indicative because they didn't issue securities, they issued different instruments that weren't regulated.
Well, I think a couple of things are interesting in AIG. Number one, AIG is the most widely held stock in pension funds and 401ks. So for the government to put them out of business very quickly would have been disastrous. Number two, they had 3 or 4 really strong businesses. Their commercial property business had $30 billion of cash last fall. their airplane leasing business, the biggest in the world, is very strong. What happened was, in a company of 85,000 employees, you had 300 employees in London who wrote something like $55 gazillion of CDSs. The legal papers, and you all should hope someday as a junior associate being assigned to this, some of the CDS swaps had 500-page legal document. The average was about 100 pages. And so they were very complex. And what happened was you had a board of directors that had no risk control, no demand of management to see what's happening off balance sheet. And I think even in a post-Enron environment, off balance sheet activities have not seemed to have decreased. So I think when the government put in 80% of their capital, again, Management 101 would have said, we're taking over payroll, we're taking over HR. And you don't pay those bonuses. And if the excuse was they were contractually obligated, that's a lot of nonsense. And let them sue you. You're suing the government. You know it'll take 20 years to get to the court. I mean, you've studied cases of that. I think they just didn't take a tough enough stand on that. But now, the difficulty now is that all the competition is going after the AIG customer base. So while they thought they could sell these businesses like property, casualty, aviation, it may be very difficult now as the business runs off. But I would have thought they would have broken it up earlier into 3 or 4 companies.
I guess it's a two-part question. I'm just wondering, because you're connected with Euronext, so you see what's going on Sure. You see what's going on in Europe. Is it just with how that's made up? That's just one aspect. Then we have Madoff and the SEC. Are we showing Europe that we don't have adequate home state regulation right now? Like, are we still able to issue over there at this point?
Well, and there's a different philosophy in Europe. Europe tends to be principle regulated according to principles. We tend to be specific rules. So in London, the FSA, the financial regulator, they have a rule, they have a principle that says you will not commingle your assets with those of the customers. If we tried to put that in the United States as a rule, we would have graduates of this school demanding that we define asset, commingled, customer. We would never get out of having a rule across the T's and dot the I's. They also tend to, when they work across regulatory barriers of countries in Europe, they have a college of regulators. So since we own 7 stock exchanges in Europe, our parent company, NYSE Euronext, when we have regulatory issues, we go to the college of regulators, which is 1 or 2 regulators from each country, who then make a determination of what we're doing. So they're trying to harmonize across the countries. But I still think you saw the U.S. economy getting blamed a lot. And my feeling is that these German banks, Japanese banks, they should have done their own due diligence on what they were buying.
I think I detected some muted criticism of Sarbanes-Oxley. If I'm correct, how would you change it?
Well, Sarbanes-Oxley itself is only 16 lines of the dreaded Section 404. It's really not that bad. The problem was that there was an absence of guidance. 3 things happened. One was Arthur Andersen went belly up. Then the SEC and the PCABU, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, did not issue any guidance as to how it should be implemented. So in every Pricewaterhouse, Ernst & Young office, they had a picture of the Arthur Andersen guys doing the perk walk and says, this could be you. So regardless of what they said at head office, the guy in the Denver office says, we're going with 0 defects. I don't care what the company said. So I was on the Honeywell audit committee then. They would come in, they would audit our audit, they would audit our controls, and then they would make an opinion of management's audit of their own audit. So he had these 3 things at $160 an hour, something like that. So I think what happened was there was this absence of guidance as to how Sarbanes-Oxley was to be implemented and how the final 4 insurance accounting firms were going to deal with it. That was the real issue. Most people now have sort of gotten used to Sarbanes-Oxley. It's expensive. But it cost us a couple $1 million to do it because we were not for profit when we went public in '05. We had to be Sarbanes-Oxley compliant. But so I think it's probably achieved some of its purposes in that the controls are tighter. But it completely missed the off-balance sheet things in big companies like AIG. And there's no chance at all, and I'm in Congress 3 or 4 times a year, there's no chance at all it'll ever be changed because it'll indicate that the Congress is soft on regulation. So there's no effort at all to do any changes to it.
In one of their classes, our professor pushes the point of compliance is not a substitution for ethics. In terms of
not a substitution for
ethics,
right.
In that regards, like with the Bernie Madoff scandal and everything else, there's been 2 schools of thought as far as reform and regulation. One is very much updating the application side, in that we have too many lawyers versus not enough practitioners as regulators, so they don't understand. Thereby, you have more compliance than you have actually ethics. And the other side is that we are rules-based, as you mentioned, versus the European model, which is principles-based. So, to maximize compliance versus ethics over compliance, what would you recommend for regulation reform?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or situation. I think you've got to have a set of business leaders who are well-grounded in ethics. And I think this, as a society, we're drifting away from that. We don't have many national leaders, Clinton, Bush, I don't think they've had fairly serious ethical lapses. But I think we're in a pendulum swing where we're going to get more regulation. And we're going to, at some point, have to have more oversight on how board of directors operate. Because I think we have to move more things that are off balance sheet now, even in a post-Enron environment, back on the balance sheet. So that you can see that a shareholder can actually see what's going on. But I don't think it's an either or. I think you've got to have, and I don't even, where do you get ethics training now? Where do you get ethics training in high school or college? Do you get any of it at all? I mean, I went to West Point in 1958, so that's like Jesuits with guns, And, so we got a lot of ethics training because in the military, poor ethics leads to people getting killed or wounded, false reporting, that kind of thing. So, I got it very early in life, 17, 18.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think regulation of rating agencies should look like. Would you favor an SRO model or direct regulation by a government agency?
Well, we proposed that our CEO, Duncan Niederauer, proposed at Davos 2 years ago that the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange, maybe some people from Chicago, spin it out as a not-for-profit and do it as a public service, charge a minimal fee. I think since so many pension funds are dependent upon buying rated securities, 401ks, I think that's more of a public service than it is a for-profit business. But we got almost no traction on it at all. It was kind of a big ho-hum. Of course, Moody's and Standard & Poor's and the other one, IFTCA, they make an awful lot of money doing that. But I think the inherent conflict of the people that are securitizing the assets paying for the rating, we've got to get away from that. And we have a lot of industry utilities. We have the Depository Trust Company. We used to have the National Securities Clearing Corp. We have the Securities Industry Automation Corp. So there is a precedent of having a not-for-profit managed by the industry to do these kind of tasks. But I'm not convinced that we're going to see it happen, at least not in the short term. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier there might be too many lawyers at the SEC. In terms of human resources and human capital, going forward, what do you think a regulator like the SEC should focus on in terms of its hiring, its staffing, those sorts of things?
Well, you certainly need a lot of lawyers because you have to interpret the 34 Act and the 40 Act, and a lot of the things they do are based upon laws. But you also need people that maybe have worked on the floor of the exchange or worked at Fidelity, doing posting trades. You need somebody that knows the plumbing of the markets. And I don't think there's enough of those. Now, there have been 220,000 layoffs in New York in the financial services industry, so there certainly are people available. But I think it's going to take a while for the new SEC commissioner to maybe focus on that. But you clearly need a mix of sort of mechanics, plumbers, versus policy and law people. And that's true in all kinds. I mean, when I was the CEO of State Street, we had about 95 lawyers. But, we had 6,000 IT specialists. We had 5,000 people that did plumbing work, pushed trades, that kind of thing. So you need a mix. Yeah.
To the extent that you think that a new federal regulator will emerge to regulate securitization, derivatives, things like that, who do you think would have that role? Would it be a new agency or would it be the Fed? Anyone in particular you think would be?
I don't think it'll be a new agency. I tell you what I would like to see. I would like to see the President or the Secretary of the Treasury task Mr. Bernanke of the Fed to take 90 or 120 days to look across all 9 regulatory agencies and come up with an early assessment of systemic risk. Now, a big systemic risk study was done 3 summers ago by Jerry Corrigan, who was, at that time, he was a former head of the New York Fed, and it was a wonderful piece of work. I'm sure some of the professors have it. I would like to see that and then move into, let's get an early assessment of where the problems are, then we can move into a permanent structure. I'd be very surprised if a new separate agency was created. But I think in this first task force, the Bernanke should pull 2 or 3 or 4 people from each of the 9 agencies, plus from industry, and sit down in a room, and come out with some sort of an assessment. But the government and Congress doesn't seem to work that way as well. Congress wants to have a final say, and I don't think you could do this by executive order, easily by executive order by the President. He doesn't need to go to Congress for this. Yeah.
Do you see the role of alternative marketplaces like dark pools and crossing networks increasing, and in terms of regulation, do you think it's adequate, or do you think there need to be changes?
Well, right now it's unregulated at all. A dark pool is where it's like eBay or Craigslist for stocks. You put up what you want to sell. There's about 45 dark pools, about 35 algorithmic trading. The cow may be already out of the barn on that. But we do find that they always come to the regulated markets, us and NASDAQ, early in the day and late in the day to set prices, because our price setting is totally transparent. The real issue with dark pools is whether it's a violation of the SEC's 34 Act, which should guarantee me standing on the floor of the exchange should have no additional information than you in classroom here about the variables of a stock. That's what the 34 Act of Equal Knowledge is based upon. I don't see how the dark pools actually are compliant with that. But I don't think these electronic crossing networks I think they're here to stay. Yeah.
Of the reforms that you see being given serious consideration on Capitol Hill, which do you think pose the greatest risk of Sarbanes-Oxley type process?
Well, you're into the sort of stage of Congress of headline seeking. We were joking upstairs about most of us in the room are too young to remember the last time Congress voted as a unified body for the good of the country. And for you students, in 1961, the National Football League decreed that even if the Patriots game was filled, you could not be telecast in Boston. So you had to drive 100 miles away. You had to go to Hartford or Portland to watch the game. And Congress rose up and smote them down 525 to 2. So I'm very skeptical. It is so political now. I mean, you think back 40 years when Everett Dirksen and Tip O'Neill would practically be in fisticuffs on the floor, but then would go have a beer. That doesn't happen anymore. You know, they don't, there's no cross-party, pollination is the wrong word, but you know, cross-party communications off. And so I'm very skeptical of whether or not they can do something that really is lasting. I do think we'll see, I'm hoping that the SEC and Treasury will sort of move to some executive orders to get things done. I think hedge funds, the hedge fund industry gave more money on Capitol Hill in 2006 election than the entire mutual fund industry. So, not convinced that that's going to happen. But I think mark-to-market, the uptick rule, something on the rating agencies, I think the SEC and the administration can do a lot of that themselves. I think we're done.
Great. Maybe I'll exercise the prerogative of the moderator to ask one last question, if that's okay, Mark. I'm delighted to hear you focus on the ethical dimension of the problems we face, because that's seldom talked about. But if you could answer this question on two levels. Number one, even before the current crisis, few of the financial services executives in this country were looked upon as statesmen in any regard, and I guess you could broaden that statement to include the Fortune 500. Part of the question is, where have the statesmen gone? And the other part of the question is that when you were the CEO of State Street here in Boston, you were viewed as a community leader in this neighborhood of ours. And now we don't have many corporations headquartered here anymore, State Street being one of the few remaining ones. And that has left a significant void in local corporate leadership. So when you combine the absence of national corporate leadership and the absence of local corporate leadership, how are we ever going to fill that void?
Well, I think the last 8 years during the Bush administration, I think Jeff Immelt of GE was about the only CEO that would speak out. I had heard stories about CEOs speaking out on the green or environment and getting a call from Karl Rove telling them to shut up. I have no way of assessing whether that's true or not. But since most companies now are global, your shareholders don't really care if you're a community leader. A community leadership requires an enormous commitment of time, which is not necessarily essential to your bottom line. And to be honest with you, sometimes you get tired of the Globe and the Herald and New York Post hanging you out to dry about something. My good friends, the Globe reporters, have accepted they would never do that. But there is a feeling, you know, when Joan Vanacci gets on your case because you've done something, after a while you say, well, I don't really need to do that. So I do think that it is a problem. And I think, especially here in Boston, where when I moved here in '91, there were 8 or 9 banks and one left. Those are global companies. State Street does business in 98 countries. And the amount of, even though the bulk of the people are here, 15,000, 16,000 out of 28,000, they have to spend as much time in Tokyo and Brussels as they do here with community affairs. So it's a question of there's just so many hours in the day. And I don't know whether there's a new generation of corporate leaders. The ones that seem to be exercising the leadership are the ones like the Google founder and Microsoft who have stepped away from the 24/7 corporate responsibility because they have so much money and they're putting it to philanthropic uses. That's where the leadership seems to be coming from, you know, Bill Gates and his wife and people like that.
Great. Or maybe you answered the question earlier with your suggestion about a CEO directing 6,000 commercial lenders to get involved in mortgage modifications and getting to the bottom of that issue. And maybe part of the answer is that CEO being recognized and not pilloried by shareholders or by the media for having the courage to have done something like that. Before we depart,
there's a really good book that just was published about 2 weeks ago by Felix Rohatyn about the big projects that the United States has done, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Erie Canal, the GI Bill. It's a very easy read. It's good airplane reading, but it's very good.
Good.
And his question is, why can't we do that again?
Great. Marshall, thank you very much.